Hello, everybody. It is Steve, your friendly neighborhood lawn gnome. Welcome back to another video over here on That's Comical. And if you're watching and it happens to be a Wednesday, happy new comic book day. Well, I am very glad to be back again. I mean, you never would know this unless I say this, but this is actually one of two recordings for the channel that I am doing this weekend. And I am glad that they both include my fellow colleague, Cami. Cami, it's always great to have you for a great discussion, regardless of anything, even if it's not comics.
Glad to be here once again.
And more importantly, we are so glad to have Lindsay back for another great discussion. And I am thrilled to have her for this specific book because this is a book that we'll get into very quickly, but it's a very art heavy book. So it was only appropriate that an artist mindset joined us for this conversation. So, Lindsay, welcome back.
Thank you very much. It's great to be back.
Yes, and before we get started, I also want to just to let everybody know that this is going to be a great discussion, a great video, but it's a little bit somber just because of the fact that this is actually going to be Lindsay's last video for the time being, hopefully not forever. Lindsay has been gracious enough to join us to help us celebrate the 85th anniversary of Batman, and I know that she has been having a wonderful time because we have seen her positive videos of these books that we have discussed on her own channel. So that's a good thing for us. But Lindsay has some very important projects that she needs to put her mind into 100%, and we totally respect her for that. But I specifically said that, Lindsay, if you were not going to join us for this one specific book, it would just be wrong in every single way possible. So we just want to say thank you for your time before we begin discussing this book, and we are so glad that you enjoyed the time that you gave to us here on That's Comical.
Thank you very much, Steve. It's been such a pleasure being a guest on this channel this year. I've had such a great time delving more into the DC and Marvel comic book world with everybody, and getting more into the Batman comics, and it's been a blast.
I'm so happy to hear that. So today we're not going to be discussing Batman. As a matter of fact, while we have two major anniversaries happening in the world of comic books and popular culture, and we have said this numerous times, most of the time on the videos where Lindsay has been present, we have the 85th anniversary of Batman, and we also have the 40th anniversary of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. But there's another smaller anniversary that's happening this year, and unless you are a comic book reader, you probably have no idea that this is happening. Back in 1994, Marvel Comics published a 4-issue miniseries unlike anything that they had ever done before. And it was also the very first time that most comic book fans got to know a very well-known writer today, Kurt Busiek, as well as one of the most recognizable and one of the most praised comic book artists in all of modern comic history. And that is actually my personal favorite in all of comics, the great Alex Ross. This year is the 30th anniversary of Kurt Busiek and Alex Ross's Marvels, a game-changing, beautiful piece about the outside looking in to the world of superheroes, or the human take on how the human race perceives the extraordinary in the world of Marvel. So, long and the short of it, before I get into the other panelists here today, I just want to say that this was a book that I actually read 2 years into its existence. I was actually lucky enough to have the original 4 copies of this book, and I bought the trade paperback knowing how big of a collector's item the original 4 issues are. But ever since I read it when I was 14 years old, this has been one of my all-time favorite stories. Kurt Busiek is one of my top 5 comic writers. Alex Ross, as I said, is my favorite comic artist, because there really is no other story that was at the time told like this. And we have discussed many original iconic stories. Just the other day, Lindsay, just in case you didn't know, Cami, myself, and Andy, we discussed Batman the Killing Joke, which of course is another iconic story in the world of comic books, but nothing like Marvel's. So, Lindsay, I gotta hear first from you, what did you think of this book overall when you read it?
Yeah, it was such a treat to read. It was definitely different than everything we've read this year, and it was yeah, I just really enjoyed seeing the superhero world through the eyes of the civilians, and especially how their mindset shifted quite a bit throughout history in the Marvel universe. And so it was really fascinating to see the different takes on the superheroes and what everybody thought of them and how it affected their lives. From an artist perspective, the art was just beautiful. I have the remastered edition that I was reading, and so in the back of mine, they have a little interview with artist Alex Ross, right? Um, and you get to see his creative process, and he used a lot of models for his work because he wanted to achieve a very realistic art style. And so it was just really cool to see all of those photos compared with all of what eventually became panels for the comic. And I really admire his art style and his dedication to the process.
Yeah, Alex Ross is a very unique creator when it comes to art because if you read his book Mythology, which really revolves around his take on DC, the follow up came a couple years later called Marvelosity, which is all about the Marvel side of things. What you get so much by the person who writes the book, Chip Kidd, who pretty much interviews Alex Ross. Um, Alex Ross not only has a love and appreciation for art itself, but he just, from his young age, adored superheroes. You will see in these books how he made these little paper cutouts of his favorite characters. So he had an artist sense from the get go before he even decided to go in this direction. He's done things that are almost reminiscent of Norman Rockwell. So he is someone who understands and appreciates the modern take on art. But he knew one day that these two worlds that he loved so much were going to meet one day. And what I take away so much from his work, you also see that in another book that we've already reviewed on this channel, his artwork that he contributed to Mark Waid's Kingdom Come, which is a phenomenal book from DC. He wanted to show the readers something completely different, as in he wanted to depict if you were to actually look up in the sky and see a superhero in your world, in the real world, they would look like this. And it's so believable when you see his artwork. They're anatomically correct. The shading of the skin, the wrinkles, the eyes are probably the most mesmerizing thing in all of his characters, which I love so much. And also the detail that he pays attention to when it comes to the costumes themselves. Like they're not extremely skin tight. You could definitely see the little folds and all of that stuff. So he puts so much complexity because that kind of artwork is very complex, but it's absolutely beautiful. Now, Cami, you are not unfamiliar to Kurt Busiek, nor are you unfamiliar to Alex Ross. I mentioned Kingdom Come, but we also were fortunate enough last year when we were celebrating the 85th anniversary of Superman, we got to read one of Kurt Busiek's other great works, Superman's Secret Identity.
That
So
was a lot of fun.
yeah, and another big thing that you will also know, I want everybody else out there to know, Kurt Busiek and Alex Ross also had another big project just a few years after Marvel over at Image called Astro City. It started out as a 6-issue miniseries, and then it became one of Kurt Busiek's longest running ongoing series. Alex Ross did all the covers, but it was Kurt Busiek's way of deconstruction of the superhero. It's a book that I have still yet to read. I've read his miniseries and I absolutely adore it. But it's, again, what Kurt Busiek does best is he brings such a human story to the masses. And you can't get more human than a story like Marvel's.
Well, I tried really hard to scour my closet for a Marvel t-shirt. Unfortunately, it is not in my wardrobe. So I did celebrate. Today is the 38th anniversary of the premiere of Double Dare.
Oh,
So
wow.
I tried,
Mark
but
Summers.
I had to pay homage to one of my favorite Nickelodeon shows. Moving on and back into the world of Marvel. This was a lot to unpack though. And I'm not really sure by saying that if you're new to the Marvel universe, this is not a good place to start, because in a way you're introduced to so many characters in this for issue series that you can follow along at some point. But I want to circle back to what you just said, Steve, in that this story is very human. And one of the things that I think resonates with you as the reader is the connection that you have to the humanity of this story, and that you can kind of almost in a way visualize yourself as a character, maybe as like a standby character as you're reading this, because it does feel so lifelike.
Right. And I actually wanted to let you guys know this is actually an epiphany that I had today while I was anticipating our discussion tonight. I actually may have discovered something very interesting about Marvels. I actually think that this may be an allegory for Marvel's comics history itself.
Oh, that's a good
And
way to look at it.
I want to prove that not just to you both, but to everybody else out there as we discuss the story. So let's begin at the beginning. So where do we begin? As a matter of fact, we begin in 1938 at the start of World War II. And we're introduced to a young photographer who hopes to work at a newspaper, Phil Sheldon. And we're also introduced to another very famous Marvel character who is such a fun character. So, Lindsay, if you don't know anything about Spider-Man, I mean, have you seen the Tobey Maguire films, if anything?
Oh, of course.
So
Yes.
you know how much every fan of Spider-Man's world loves J. Jonah Jameson.
Yeah.
So to see a young, hotshot J. Jonah Jameson as a buddy to Phil Sheldon with very high hopes and a very positive attitude, I must say, wanting to really try and climb the corporate ladder and become the man who runs the Daily Bugle. That's just a fun way to start it, even though a major portion of the discussion is the fact that there is, in fact, a war going on overseas, and it's only just a matter of time before the United States joins in the battle. But I mentioned the year, 1938. Why is that year so significant? It's because it's the very first published Marvel comic that comes out in that year, featuring the Human Torch. Not the Human Torch from the Fantastic Four. This was what threw me off when I first read the book back in 1996. This is a very different Human Torch who was introduced in that comic. And at that time, it wasn't even called Marvel Comics. I think it was called Timely Comics at the time. And Stan Lee wasn't in charge. So that's why we start where we start. We're starting not only at the beginning of the story, but we're also sort of beginning at Marvel's beginnings. I'm not sure if Phil Sheldon and J. Jonah Jameson are supposed to be an allegory in the case of Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, because Stan Lee and Jack Kirby are the reason why Marvel is as huge as it is. So as I'm preparing for this and rereading this book for the first time in a long time, I'm starting to view this in that kind of a way, because it's interesting that you said earlier, Cami, that this may not be the best thing to read for a first-time reader, but what it is very interesting is this is sort of a Marvel Comics history lesson, if you think about it.
No, absolutely. I'm glad that you said that, because I felt like some of the times, even though these were familiar characters that I had seen depicted on the big screen, or, obviously had just touched on in other areas of the small Marvel journey I've been on, I felt like there was different variations of these characters, and that's kind of what kept pulling me, in and out of the story. I'm like, was there a different Human Torch? Is there a different side to Spider-Gwen? Like I was doing all of these back and forth things, like, should I know more than I do? Do I know enough? Am I qualified to read this? Because I really did feel like there was such a historical underlay there that I wasn't sure if I was missing something, and so I found myself kind of going back and forth between the pages just to make sure I was captivating everything.
So we're introduced to the Human Torch, and what do we get? We get exactly what you expect, a true human reaction. Similar to what I don't know, children who picked up this comic book for the first time, or maybe even parents that were looking and saying, "What in God's name are you reading, kid?" Like, this is something that's different. This is something that's baffling because this is the superhero. The superhero was a brand new thing in 1938 because we also have to remember on the other side of the proverbial comic book pond, that's the year that Action Comics #1 comes out over at DC Comics and the world is introduced to Superman. So it's such a pivotal year for Marvel and for comic book history in general because we were given something fresh and new that we had never experienced as a human race. And Phil Sheldon is our eyes looking into this phenomenal new thing. And it is his job throughout these 4 issues to try and give us a guiding light and give us an idea of how do we perceive this brand new phenomenon.
Um, I think you actually answered a question that I was going to ask both of you about book one in this was I was wondering why they opened with the Human Torch because the book like overall is about like seeing the superheroes from an ordinary person's perspective. So I was wondering why they opened with a superhero instead of Phil seeing the superhero at first. And so but I think that could be the answer is that he was the first superhero Marvel came out with, right? In 1938. And so it makes sense why he's the beginning of this story as well.
Yep, and soon after the Human Torch was made, we are introduced to another hero. We are introduced to Namor the Submariner, who is not necessarily a hero at the very beginning. As a matter of fact, Namor, even to this very day, is a very unusual character. He is really more of an anti hero. So he is somewhat liked by some and somewhat not liked by others, but he is still a very interesting character. And what's very interesting about him is that he basically becomes, in this story, specifically the very first comic book villain. But what's also very interesting about Marvel as opposed to DC, Marvel didn't really become extremely popular until a few decades later. But the one thing that I think Marvel pretty much understood from the get go was that everything was never going to be black and white and that there's always going to be shades of gray. And again, this is a great depiction of a human looking in on this new threat that's coming in. Like, they're not interested in knowing what his story is. We don't know why he's here. All we know is that he doesn't look like us. It's a fear of the other. And he is clearly not coming for the sake of peace because we first hear Phil's girlfriend at the time running into the diner where he's chatting with J. Jonah Jameson saying something happened. This naked man just jumped out of the water and they couldn't even penetrate him with bullets. And he picked up cars. He created devastation. So it's a very interesting point. Really, like straight out of the gate, it's like first we get a superhero that nobody's sure of, and then we get a super villain or just someone that we don't know. And of course, what happens? The superhero is asked to take care of this other supernatural being, and that's when we see the point where humans start looking at these people or extraordinary beings and they start taking sides like, oh, there's the good guy, there's the bad guy. But again, is Namor the Submariner really a bad guy? Because his intentions are he wants his world to prevent from getting damaged. He's the king of Atlantis. The human world is causing problems, and he's trying to send a message saying, stop doing it.
Point one, Atlanteans do wear clothes. So why is this man naked all the time? Secondly, I feel like there was kind of like a subplot here that he was kind of on a vendetta in the beginning, almost like he was upset because someone in the world of Atlantis had been wronged or had been captured. I really didn't fully understand or get that flushed feeling throughout. I know it was like revisited in book 2 or 3 when you had all those kind of beautiful space creatures, when we're introduced to Gwen for the first time. However, it felt like in that moment he kind of reiterated that he was there for justice for that individual, but we never really get the person or what the issue was. I mean, maybe that was the whole reason as to bringing him back, just to kind of show that he was angry about something and giving him purpose and all of these different um appearances that he had, but I felt really unfinished with his storyline.
Yeah, I can definitely understand that. I mean, again, could that be part of the allegory that I can think about? It's just like, letting people know that certain heroes, even though you haven't seen them in the comics in a while, they're still here. They still have a purpose. I don't know. That's just me. But so, of course, as the story progresses in the first issue, we see a little bit more into Phil's relationship trying to woo his eventual wife. And it was a little bit sad at the beginning where she did not want to be engaged to him when she realized that things were heating up in World War II and that eventually he was going to go overseas to be a photographer for the troops. And it's a little bit, I really do appreciate the fact that even when you see, the thing I really appreciate about this book is the fact that no matter what, the heroes are always in the background. They're never the true main character in this story. It is always the humans. It is fun to see the bright colors every now and again, but at the end of the day, it's really about the outside looking in to the extraordinary. And of course, when we discover that we're officially going to be going into the war, the American government basically says, well, the good news is we have a competitive edge. We have superheroes that can help us fight this war. They want the Human Torch to help them fight. Eventually, they try to come to terms with Namor to get him to fight as well. But of course, now that we're getting into 1942, we're introduced to another very well-known superhero, and it's probably one of the more recognizable ones because that was what was very interesting about the very beginnings of Marvel Comics in the 1930s going into the 1940s. We didn't have all of these major names that we know and love. And when we take a look at characters like Batman and Superman basically heading into their going 90 at this point in time, we're only seeing anniversaries like 60th anniversaries or 50th anniversaries or even 40th anniversaries of characters from Marvel because the Marvel characters are so much younger than the DC characters. But, thank God Jack Kirby was around and Jack Kirby created Captain America, the true first recognizable and fan favorite superhero of Marvel Comics. And we get him becoming who he is and him becoming the symbol of the United States when it comes to fighting World War II.
And sad at the beginning, the whole relationship between Phil and Doris was sad throughout the entire series. I've just felt so depressed reading most of this. There was just a haze over this 4-part series. I felt like Phil really never got out of that dark state. I felt like he was always at odds with himself. I always felt like he never thought he was good enough. He was never the right man for his family. There was a lot of darkness here, I mean, despite all of the spectacular stuff that was happening in the background, and we were introduced to all these amazing Marvel characters, and we had a very fluid storyline. I mean, there was always an action scene, there was always enough to keep the momentum moving forward and everything, but there was just this depression that just loomed in the whole story, and it was just kind of sad. I even to the very end, and we won't get there yet, but I felt like there was never resolve with that depression, and it was a little disheartening.
Yeah, I mean, of course, one of the few things that I do love about Alex Ross is that there is always that point in every issue when it's basically Alex Ross's time to shine, and we get these beautiful splash pages. I mean, I can look at this picture God knows how many times the heroes descending upon a Nazi base. It's just absolutely stunning and gorgeous when you see some wonderful artwork like that. I'm sure that you can agree, Lindsay.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, just the art was stunning. I forgot to mention this earlier, but my initial what the art initially reminded me of was those illustrated like historical books that I used to read as a kid, like Get to Know Thomas Edison, like kind of that vibe. And I'm not sure if that's what he was achieving, but that's what it reminded me of at first.
So there's a little bit of good news and there's a little bit of bad news. The war obviously comes to an end, but these extraordinary beings are still there. You know, post war, Phil officially starts to move up the ranks at his independent newspaper. J. Jonah Jameson is clearly working over at the Daily Bugle, but the Human Torch and the Submariner are at it again. And of course, Phil, being the talent that he is asked to go into the fray and capture as many photos as he can. And this, of course, is a perfect metaphor for what happens when the humans get in the way. Because even though the heroes are who they are, there unfortunately is always going to be damage done, and to a certain degree, there can be an accidental tragedy. And in this case, Phil gets blinded in one eye because a piece of debris hits him in the middle of the Torches and Namor's fight. And it's sad that he literally has his life starting to go on the up and ups. You know, he's made peace with Doris. They got married, and he's doing very well at his job. There's no more war, but there's still these superheroes running around, and now it's a matter of they're clearly not going away. We now have to live with them. How are we going to manage?
I think the best thing for their relationship would have been if he would have made the decision to go to Europe and take his family with him. However, I think that we wouldn't have had obviously the story that came to be because everything obviously took place there on American soil versus, you know, European. I think if it had went the European route, it would have been very war based. And I'm so glad it didn't go in that direction because you have so many timepieces like this that tend to study very heavily or speak very heavily to war efforts and historical attributes of those time periods. So it's kind of nice to get like an actual refreshing story, something that you hadn't heard before. And so to take this from the perspective that we got was so cool.
So then when we move into the next book, we fast forward very much into the future. We're now officially in the height of one of the most heated decades in American history. And that, of course, is the 1960s. As a matter of fact, in issue number 2 and issue number 3, only a year passes. So we're going into 1965, and then in issue number 3, we go into 1966. So what's going on in 1965? Well, let me go back to my allegory here. So at this point in time, we have had everything from the burning of comic books and the discontinuation of superheroes and any kind of horror noir comic in the 1950s because parents and high authority figures believe that comics are not good for kids. And then we have the birth of the Comics Code. But then when we get into the 60s, the silver age of comics begins because we're also in the space race. So comic books now want to bring superheroes back and they want to give them a little bit more of a science fiction twist. So over at DC, they bring the Holy Trinity back. Of course, that's Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman, but they introduce new incarnations. We get Barry Allen as the Flash. We get Hal Jordan as Green Lantern. So we get some really great new things. But over at Marvel, they're having a superhero revolution thanks to Stan Lee taking the driver's seat over at Marvel Comics and having Jack Kirby by his side. in 1961, we get America's favorite comic book family, the Fantastic Four. I have such a soft spot for the Fantastic Four. In 1962, we get probably the most popular superhero in all of the world. And that, of course, is debatably so. Cami, I want to say debatably so, because some people will say that Spider-Man is the best one, and others would say Batman. It's really hard for me. It's like trying to choose between my children. But we then, in 1963, we get the Hulk, we get Iron Man, we get the Avengers, Captain America comes back. So we're now officially in such an amazing time for comic books. And you see that in the beginning of issue number 2. Phil has definitely gotten up there in age. He's now got a family. He's got 2 beautiful daughters with Doris. And he is now thinking about starting to go on his next adventure and write a book featuring a lot of his things that he has done over the years with maybe something new attached to it. But the most important thing is we see the attitude of the people. When Captain America jumps into action, the crowd goes wild. When they see Iron Man zipping through the sky, they get excited. When there's an announcement that Reed Richards and Susan Storm are going to get married, the whole city of New York wants to see this. This is like the royal wedding for comic books. People get very, very excited. So it's an exciting time because people now know who these heroes are and they absolutely love these heroes. I mean, I think there's a little bit of a panel where they talk about the fact that the Avengers managed to find and unfreeze Captain America, and now he's back and everybody's happy that Captain America is back because they loved him back in World War II. It's also a really cool thing because the people who first experienced the introduction of Captain America are now telling their kids about how they remembered being younger and seeing Captain America in action and how they loved him just as much as they do. So that's a really great place to start in this book. But then everything goes very dark because there's another group of heroes that are out there. And back to the allegory, obviously, we're talking about the X-Men. So the X-Men came out in 1963. But there's some very interesting things that I personally learned about the X-Men. The X-Men had their following, but it wasn't a very popular book from Marvel Comics when it first came out in 1963. As a matter of fact, a couple of years later, X-Men would get discontinued and wouldn't come back until 1975. I didn't know that. So they called this second book Monsters because of the fact that we are introduced to the X-Men and then we're introduced to the world of the mutants. They're not looked at as heroes because these are people who look like freaks of nature. These are people that may be dressing up in costumes, but one of them has the ability to turn himself into ice. One person actually walks around with wings on his back. He can't get rid of those wings. One of them has to wear a very strange and intimidating visor all the time. So people get very scared. And of course, in the real world, what's going on in America? We're dealing with the civil rights movement. We're dealing with hatred and fear of other people in our own country. So this is also when it's funny that we talked about this last night, Cami, when we were talking about our Killing Joke discussion. Social commentary. This is a perfect example of a allegory for social commentary.
Very much so. And these two, well, books 2 and 3, that's kind of where me, as not being so privy to the Marvel character base, I had to kind of go back and forth. I had to stop for a few pages and be like, okay, who is this character? And, it wasn't so much the heroes, I very much recognize the Avengers, the Fantastic Four, but it was all of those monsters that you referenced that I'm like, okay, who are half of these characters, so I had a very difficult time with that. The X-Men, for me, it was always a positive experience because I didn't get into the X-Men until the 90s. Obviously, unfortunately, we had a very different wave of X-Men. So it was always a positive experience for me. But I remember those very early episodes of X-Men, which this comic reminded me of, when the mutants were feared and people didn't know what to expect. They didn't know how to take, that special gift that each of these mutants possessed. And so I definitely took that feeling of those first few episodes into these pages. But yeah, definitely social commentary was felt throughout those scenes, especially when they're kind of fighting each other in the streets. You definitely see that conflict there. So I think that also kind of added to that dark, dismal feeling. But it definitely showcased so many very prominent Marvel characters.
Yeah, I mean, the best part, the one part that lingers throughout the entire book, because the book itself goes back to it, it's when Phil actually joins a bunch of his neighbors who have cornered the X-Men in an alleyway. He actually throws a piece of brick and it hits Iceman in the head. And that part always gets me upset because Iceman happens to be my favorite X-Man. But Cyclops says those words that stick in Phil's mind, and that is, they're not worth it, because they know that they are Homo superior. They are one step above. They are the future of human evolution. And they will still fight for the sake of good and saving a whole race of people who despise them. But in the end, they still remind themselves, we know how strong we are. Because if we really wanted to go in that direction, and if we ever did, we would cause some serious damage.
I also appreciated book two also because this is the first time that I actually got to see human Tony Stark. I'm not very, versed, like I said, in Marvel and the comics. So I got to see him as the party goer that many people reference, and that kind of 60s kind of vibe of camaraderie, when you had the cocktail parties and everybody got fancy. And so that was a really cool take. And that was something that was really special to me that I took out of book two.
I think what's very interesting is because of the fact that the X-Men are basically the main theme that's throughout it, it's also really interesting how those thoughts of fear and hatred spill out into the people, to the heroes that are actually beloved. Like, there are a couple of moments in the book where we hear about how people are terrified of the Hulk, how they love the Fantastic Four, but oh my goodness, that rock guy is so ugly. So it's like, even the Thing can't even catch a break, because he fights the good fight, he saves the world, but at the end of the day, people still don't understand him and they fear him just because of how he looks. And he even wonders from time to time, is it worth it, because they don't care for me? Hello, cat.
Hello, this is Tails.
Hello, Tails.
One of the things though that you bring that up, that was not confusing, but just it was a lot of back and forth as a reader, is that feeling that the people in this story would give you, because one minute they hated these monsters and these superheroes, and then the next minute they loved them or just didn't remember. It was, he kept referencing that. Phil kept saying that, it's almost like you forget after the chaos, that how you were and how you acted and what you said. And so that was, I use the term confusing because as a reader, I was just like, well, how can you ensue violence? How can you get in physical altercations with your neighbors and just forget about it the next day? Like I'm not really understanding that part of the story. Was it just that they were so overwhelming and they just couldn't fathom what was happening before their eyes, that everything was in a dream sequence for them, or they felt like it was a dream sequence continuously, so they behaved such a way that was not normal from their day to day, that they would just wake up the next day and, oh, okay, yeah, everything's fine, we'll go back to normal, until obviously the next big chaotic event.
You bring up a good point, and I really just think it's the human condition. It's just like, we're human beings. We're so faulty. It's just like, we love. Come on, it's like your favorite sports team. When they're doing so well, you adore them, and the minute they blow it, they say, "Oh, they suck. I don't want to follow these guys again."
That
and
was
yet,
me today. I refused to watch the San Francisco 49ers because they sucked.
well, the Mets unfortunately lost the game against the Phillies today, so I wasn't too thrilled either. But yeah, the Jets had a horrible game against Minnesota too, so I did not have a good day in sports. But anyway, enough of the sports talk. The other interesting piece of this is how Phil's attitude is towards the mutants, and he has those conversations with his daughters, and he has this conversation with his wife. They see the live broadcasting of Charles Xavier talking with Bolivar Trask, and Bolivar Trask introduces the Sentinels. And, you know, Phil is clearly, ever since his encounter, not necessarily on the side of the mutants, because, again, this is a guy who only saw them, from a distance. He never really got the opportunity to truly understand the trials and the tribulations of the mutants until he gets a very big surprise. And that's a very powerful part of the second issue. There's people in his neighborhood saying there's a mutant in our neighborhood. We got to get it. We got to kill it. We got to get it out of here. And then he finds out where that mutant is, and not just where it is, it's a child.
A cute child. It's like an alien child. I was like, oh, I'll take it. I'll put it in my basement. It was so adorable. We didn't really get a lot of Xavier either in this series. I know obviously the X-Men weren't front and forward. There was a lot of things going on, but I had hoped to get more from Xavier in this series.
Yeah, I agree with you. There isn't that much X-Men action. Like, you just had that one big encounter with them, and then it just is one of those moments that just carries on throughout the book.
Mhm.
But I think it's really more so of the overall theme of the book itself, where it really does carry the spirit of the X-Men throughout the book. So yeah, I mean, like, it's, to me, that whole scene where Phil finds out that it's his family that's actually hiding the girl, that's very much like Anne Frank-esque, like hiding a refugee and stuff like that. It's a scary thing. And he's like, what do I do? Like, oh my God, I could literally go outside right now and say to the neighbors, she's here, I have her. But he sees the faces of his family and he realizes, maybe I need to take a step back and really think a little bit more about my attitude towards mutants.
Well, and I think that happens to decent human beings in any type of violent situation like that, where you have to do some self reflection and ask yourself, is this really truly who I am, or am I just kind of following the masses in this instance? And I think he realized he had to kind of take a step back because he was becoming part of this hate mob that was ensuing within his own neighborhood, only to look at the innocent faces of his children and to realize this mutant that he is so fearful of is the same age as his children, and they obviously loved and cared for her for some time. They referenced, they thought they were feeding a dog under the table. Well, lo and behold, they were feeding this mutant child. So it had been a part of their family for some time. And I think once Phil was able to do that introspection and realize, you know what, maybe this isn't what this is designed to be, maybe this is not who I am designed to be, then he kind of looked at the whole thing from a different perspective. But I think he did carry that weight again throughout the series. And I feel like no matter what he accomplished, no matter what he did, personally or professionally, it just was never enough. There was just that constant drive to one up himself, and even at his best, he just didn't feel good enough.
Yeah. And the problem is, at the end of the second book, the whole feeling of the human race towards the mutants is not going to be getting cooled down. It's not getting any better. And that's the way it really has been for the last 60 years in the world of mutant kind in the Marvel comics. I mean, mutants have definitely become a more larger presence in the world of Marvel comics. There's been more crazy intense stories, more stories that truly involve the humans and mutants together, making much more contact. But the end of this book is so heartbreaking because the little girl decides that even though I'm not really being a bother to these people, they truly are okay with me being here. she still does not want them to get hurt. That's how the X-Men feel. They're putting themselves in harm's way for a race that hates them, but they're still going to do it because they believe it's the right thing to do. They are heroes. Even though they're hated, they are heroes. And this little girl believes that she has to make the ultimate sacrifice because she doesn't want to be the cause of any more death or pain or destruction.
Oh yeah, so to echo what you said earlier, Cami, I think a big reoccurring theme that we see throughout this book is the main character Phil checking in with himself and like what he believes as opposed to what the crowds seem to believe, which it seems like sometimes the crowds are at odds with each other and sometimes they all have a collective opinion, and he's kind of always checking in with himself, like, what do I believe? What is right? Um, and that was a big scene too, where he comes home and initially he's afraid that his family is going to be hurt because he finds the mutant child in his house, and then he sees his kids are scared and his wife is scared that something that they don't want the child to be hurt, and then he looks into the child's eyes, and that's when he doesn't know how to move forward, but we know for sure that he wants to keep them safe. So
Yeah, it's a very powerful. I think that the even issues of this four-part story are much better than the odd issues. Those are my personal thoughts, but as a whole, the story is wonderful. So then we move into issue number 3, only 1 year after these events take place, and just when you think things can't get even more crazy, oh boy, do they get crazy. Because we are introduced to the Marvel Cosmic Universe, which is another big step for Marvel Comics. I mean, the Fantastic Four is one of the most popular books at the time. The Fantastic Four are beloved by many. So let's give the Fantastic Four a truly extraordinary task. And we get the Galactus trilogy, The Coming of Galactus, an iconic piece of Marvel history. Truthfully, I am waiting for the Galactus trilogy issues to become facsimile editions because I want to read this story so badly. Next year, as a matter of fact, in January, there's going to be facsimile copies of Fantastic Four #1. So I am very excited to pick up the book, and I'm really excited to read it. As a matter of fact, at this point in time, Fantastic Four #1 is now the highest monetarily valued auctioned comic book in history.
wow.
A few weeks ago, they found a graded copy of Fantastic Four #1, a 9.6 copy of Fantastic Four. That is a very great condition book. That book sold about 3 weeks ago for over $2 million. So that's how valuable this book is in the history of mankind and comic books. So we get this another crazy situation. Strange events are taking place in the sky. People are running around saying the end is near. Nobody knows what to do. The other major heroes seem to be away on a secret mission. But then out of nowhere, the Planet Eater, the Devourer of Worlds, Galactus, comes down with his herald, Silver Surfer. And it's the Fantastic Four alone that jumps in to take on this threat. And this is a very different threat than what the humans have ever seen before, because this is a gigantic, size-wise cosmic being. And he basically has come to eat this world, to take all of its life force for himself, because that's what Galactus does. He feeds off life-filled worlds. And he is very hard to satisfy because he is always hungry. So it's up to the Fantastic Four to go in there and stop him. And it's a very interesting mix of ways and methods that are used to not necessarily even defeat Galactus, but allow Galactus to understand that Earth and the human race are worth allowing to let live. But again, the human race is a fickle creature, and they get so twisted in their emotions because they don't know what's going on. I think there's a point in the book where someone yells, "What's taking the Fantastic Four so long? Like, are they even still alive? Did Galactus kill them?" So, like, the human race is just literally sitting there and watching this big structure in the sky. They don't know what is happening. They're scared out of their wits. They have no idea if their heroes are alive or dead. So, emotions are running wild. And the truth of the matter is, that's kind of normal in situations that may not be that extraordinary in the real world. But I mean, look at the world that we're living in right now. Look at what's going on overseas. Everyone is on pins and needles, regardless of how you feel about whatever side it is. So it's equivalent to a situation like this, but just with a science fiction and cosmic twist.
This issue 3, is a reminder as to why I so heavily leaned into the DC universe and why I'm not a Marvel girl. As epic as this issue is supposed to be, I found it very underwhelming. I thought it was awesome to have kind of a scientific viewpoint. Obviously, we get introduced to the Silver Surfer here, which is one of my favorite Marvel characters of all time. I did love the cinematic view of the fiery sky and the rocks and everything like that, if that's what those were. And I just found the main villain to be very meh.
Well, that's the thing. He's not gonna have a fist fight with a hero.
Well,
He's
and
not
it
gonna
wasn't
do
even
that.
a fist fight that I was looking for. Even the dialogue is just, it's not there for me. So I just felt like 3 drug on a bit. Obviously there's a lot of dialogue amongst the people, and this is a very human driven story. So, if I guess I was looking for it amongst the villains, it wasn't going to be there anyways. But again, this was a stark reminder for me, no pun intended, of why I am not a Marvel girl.
Yeah, Galactus is definitely an unusual character. I mean, I'm currently reading 1984's Secret Wars, and Galactus is in this book, but there's so many other villains in there, and he's like the least interesting character because that's the thing that people, I say this a lot. When you take a look at the Marvel films, one of the Marvel films that everyone seems to wail on and think is so terrible is Eternals. People just say because it doesn't feel like a Marvel movie, it's so boring. I actually enjoy that movie a great deal. But why do I feel that way? It's because I understand the cosmic world of Marvel. The Marvel cosmic world is not about superheroes or supervillains. Then, of course, someone will say, well, what about the Guardians of the Galaxy? I'm like, the Guardians of the Galaxy are humans in the cosmic world. So, of course, this is what you're going to expect from the Guardians. The cosmic beings are very dialogue heavy, very quiet, very proud, solitary characters because they don't care about the little people. They don't care. They don't want to fight. They don't want to cause problems to such a small scale because they know they are so powerful. And if they want to do some serious damage, they know that they can and they will. That's what people don't understand about the cosmic being. I'm not saying that the people in this room feel that way, but I'm just trying to explain that to a certain degree. So
Well,
Galactus is
maybe that's why it feels so underwhelming though, because you do have Galactus, which he obviously takes mount on the tower and he starts ripping it apart, and you feel like, okay, he is this powerful, mighty villain. But then it's like, but why? I mean, what is he doing? Is he trying to just intimidate humans? And if that's the case, then just squish them all and take over and move about. I had a very difficult time understanding how these characters infiltrated into the human world. And there was just this really odd balance between humans and them, where in the DC world, and I hate to keep referencing, but that's
Me
really
too.
my
That's
my
important.
basis. There's a lot more human interaction. I mean, we really feel like Superman and Batman and Wonder Woman are trying to save humans for the greater good of continuing the human race or saving them from some cataclysmic event, you know. But here it's like they're causing chaos in our world with each other with no regard to human life. And then you have these humans that are kind of like rebelling against this whole, I don't know, this world that's infiltrated their own. And then at what cost? Like, okay, we're gawking and we're interested and it's fascinating and all of these things, which really, again, that's what this story is all about, you know, just them infiltrating our world and how we adapt and how we're just kind of observers in our own environment. But it's so odd. It's a lot.
You know what? I just had another crazy thought. Literally, just this very second. You know
Mhm.
what Galactus is a metaphor for? Communism. It's that looming threat. You don't know what it is, but you know it's out there and you know it's so powerful, and yet you don't know what's the right way to take it on. And it's like the Fantastic Four infiltrating it, and like the way that people feel about it, like, you know, constantly changing their minds. That's like us going into the Vietnam War to stop communism, you
If
know?
I have to think that heavily reading my comic books, though, I don't want it. You know, like honestly, I feel like the more you kind of dive into this, Steve, and you kind of explain it, yes, all of that makes perfect sense. But I don't want to have to dig that deeply to understand where the writers were coming from. At least when I dive into a DC comic, it's blatantly in my face. It's telling me, hey, this is lore. This is an origin story. This is, you know, just something original. And you get a nice mix or a balance when humans are involved. If it's obviously just in their world amongst themselves, it's still epic and awesome and it flows better. So I don't know, I'm just kind of being a hater on this one. It's just absolutely gorgeous on paper. I mean, you just can't mess with a Ross painting or a drawing, you know. I mean, it's just amazing to look at. But I'm just trying to better understand the story. Like, what's the point of all of this?
Book three, especially for me, kind of reminded me of like my viewing or reading experience when I'm reading or watching a superhero story from the perspective of the superheroes versus this one, because the superhero seems to be like always in the know or gets the information much faster than a civilian would. And then in the movies and comics, we see everything happening. There's no like, oh, I can't see what's happening. If you were a civilian in this world, you wouldn't really get the intel that the superhero has. You're just seeing it all happen, and you can't really see that well because it's happening like far away in the sky or something. So it's very confusing and chaotic and scary too. Is kind of what I got from book three.
I like the way your brain works because that's so eloquently put. I think that's exactly what I was trying to say, and you summed it up beautifully. I think that's the issue that I'm having with this, is that this is told from a human perspective, and you are 100,000% correct, Lindsay, that we are not getting the details that I'm accustomed to, because I think that this narrative is not something I'm accustomed to. And I think that's why it is so challenging for me to resonate with this and to connect with it in some way that it sucks me in. You know, visually it's so appealing. You can't complain with that. But I think from a storyboard perspective, I don't need my superhero stories told to me from a human perspective, because that is the disconnect. You know, I am not getting all of the detail. And I think Lindsay hit it on the head. Now I understand why I'm just not resonating with this.
Hold, I don't really know how this was perceived when it first hit the comic shelves, this whole story about the comic of the coming of Galactus and the true introduction of the Marvel Cosmic. I mean, I've never fully understood the Marvel Cosmic as much as I did the DC Cosmic. And I also feel that, Jack Kirby helped create this character as well. Galactus is one of his co-creations, but eventually Kirby would leave Marvel Comics and he would go to DC Comics and he would create his very much beloved Fourth World and the New Gods, who would eventually become a part of the DC canon lore. And we'd have those amazing characters like Darkseid and Highfather and the Female Furies, like all those great characters, the battles between New Genesis and Apocalypse. I think that he had a little bit more liberty to create a universe with cosmic characters like that. Not so much here. But again, I think the other reason why this story is so memorable is merely because of the fact that, it's the Fantastic Four. And you're right, maybe seeing this story from a perspective that is not necessarily the heroes is not the best way to tell this story. But again,
I think too that's another disconnect for me, because you raved about the Fantastic Four being one of your favorites in the Marvel universe. It's never been a favorite of mine. That's actually my first introduction to the world of Marvel, was the Fantastic Four, and I felt the same exact way then that I do now, having read this. I was very underwhelmed with their storylines. There was nothing that I felt kept me intrigued, that kept me wanting to come back and get more stories out of that. It wasn't until X-Men that I actually cared about Marvel.
got it. Noted. So then we get into the fourth and final part of this story, and this is definitely a very heavy way to end it. But on a positive note, Phil has officially decided that he is going to move on. He's now officially selling his book. We're sort of having a meta moment here because his Marvel's book is selling like hotcakes with all of these amazing pictures that he took. But we're also finally introduced and we're finally given a story that is based on a hero who has been in the background all this time, and we never actually got to see him in full force. And that, of course, is your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. Why is it that Spider-Man is so beloved by so many people? It's because of the fact that this was the very first time that we ever got a superhero that's a kid, And the funniest thing was, I recently watched the documentary about Marvel Comics, and Stan Lee was talking about Spider-Man, and his boss at the time said to him, how can a kid be the main superhero? The kid is supposed to be the sidekick. But it's so interesting how he resonates with so many people, because Stan Lee and Steve Ditko created probably the most relatable superhero. And I love that I've heard in so many documentaries about these characters. I love how people are not as interested about Spider-Man fighting any of his nemesis like the Green Goblin or the Sinister Six. They want to know, is he going to get that tested on time? Is he going to mend his relationship with Gwen Stacy or his next girlfriend, Mary Jane? Like, how is he going to explain to Aunt May why he has missed this big thing that he was supposed to do? And he can't tell them that he's Spider-Man. That's what makes Spider-Man so special and so relatable amongst many. But the other great thing about this character is how he is portrayed and how he is perceived by the media, particularly J. Jonah Jameson, because boy, does Jameson hate Spider-Man. And how is he going to feel when he finally, somewhere down the line in 50 years, realized this kid's been working for me all this time? That's the best part about it. The fact that Peter Parker is right under his nose, and he's giving J. Jonah Jameson the best pictures of Spider-Man ever, and J. Jonah Jameson just cannot put two and two together. He just cannot do it. But that's what makes these characters so memorable and so lovable. But at the same time, the other thing that happens in this book is the fact that Phil is introduced to a young go-getter named Gwen Stacy. He has no idea who she is. He has no idea of his connections to any of the superheroes out there, but he appreciates her because she's a young, spunky go-getter. And we are now heading into a landmark moment in comic book history. We're now in the year 1973, so we're out of the 60s now. What's been going on ever since we got the Silver Age of comic books and heading into the Bronze Age? The readers, and not just the readers, the creators, are sick and tired of what they've been writing for the last decade. They're sick and tired of the kid-friendly camp. We know that we need to keep a positive image, but there's so many other directions that we can go into. And if you take a look at some of the stories that we have discussed here, even though they've been predominantly Batman, think about stories like The Killing Joke. We think about stories like Arkham Asylum. We think of stories like Batman Year One. These are extremely dark stories. So all of these stories, you think of Alan Moore, you think of Frank Miller. These are the guys that brought comics back to their dark roots in the 1980s, and that was pretty much where comics went up until today. But the dark tones and the heavy situations in comics really started in this year, 1973, because we got an extremely shocking Spider-Man story, and that was the death of Gwen Stacy. It's an iconic book. It was the death of a character, not even a superhero, but a character that meant so much to so many people, including Spider-Man himself. And that would spill out into a young man just a few years later, Chris Claremont, and he decides, I'm going to create this story called the Dark Phoenix Saga. And the rest is history. So what's so interesting about this story is Phil and him trying to come to grips with a hero like Spider-Man, because he doesn't really know how to feel about this character. It's not the same as the mutants. This is a completely different character. I think the best moment in the book is the panel where Spider-Man is crawling up the windows of the Daily Bugle, and like everybody gets freaked out when they suddenly see him, and like, oh my God. And they're like saying, and they don't even know what to do, but like, oh my God, he's terrible, he's a menace, J. Jonah Jameson was right. It's like, that's a very, very crazy scene. I love it. But he doesn't know how to feel about Spider-Man, especially with J. Jonah Jameson pretty much breathing down his neck.
Well, I guess so the beginning of book 4 reminded me a lot of how celebrity cult or like a lot of like non-celebrities view celebrities. Like one moment they're idolizing them, the next they're like trying to rip them to shreds. And I think like we were kind of seeing that with like the Avengers in book 3 a little bit, and then here with Spider-Man, everyone's looking for a reason to say something bad about him in the paper, it seems. And so I think that was where Phil decided he was going to try to like find out more with like no biases, I guess. And I think initially he was like, I'm going to try to clear Spider-Man's name, and then eventually he just started learning more about him and how people view him. So.
And there's some other very interesting things that happen towards the end of issue 3 and towards the beginning of issue number 4. We start to notice that things are starting to get a little bit more darker and a little bit more real. And more importantly, the way that the superheroes carry themselves is very different, because one of the characters that we're briefly introduced to in issue number 4 is Luke Cage, and how he is a hero for hire. Like, he expects to get paid for what he does in regards to being a hero. And it's a very strange way to stomach it. And also, we hear in the background about Daredevil, because Daredevil is another hero who is out there, and he's been around for quite some time, but now we're hearing some very, dark and gritty things because he is right down there in the trenches fighting the small time fights as opposed to the big grand coming of Galactuses of the world. So there's very different kinds of superheroes now, and they're doing very different heroic deeds. So it's a very confusing time for the human race in how they perceive their superheroes.
Well, and again, this is where I kind of find the story a little bit underwhelming. You're introduced to all these characters. A lot of them just have these stories within stories that don't really go anywhere. And it's like, well, why are we seeing this character? Like, what does it have to do with this? And I guess it was just kind of an homage to the yesteryear of Marvel and taking us into the future of Marvel is kind of my take on this 4-part series. I did appreciate in book 4, however, the return of Submariner and all of those robotic creatures. I thought that was beautifully done. And then you kind of do get the take of, well, maybe he wasn't so bad after all. You get a look for inside the beauty that is Gwen Stacy and how she perceives the world. And it's in that moment that we really do get the truest form of humanity from Phil, where he realizes this is like a come to realization moment. This wasn't about anything that I thought it was about. This is really just about protecting people just like her, the innocent, those that really are just pure of heart. And in that moment there's a beauty in all of the darkness, and then unfortunately in just a short breath later we lose her, and that was just really hard to take because you're rooting for this potential positive ending. We discussed this when we were talking about The Killing Joke. You're always kind of hoping for the good ending. You never want the villain to win. And even though it's not a villain per se that wins in the end here, in a way it feels that way. You feel like there's some sense of defeat because you're hoping that she provides this journal of her father's to Phil, and Phil is able to clear the name of Spider-Man, and then somehow this just epic ending is going to happen, and it's like it's somber. It's nothing like you would expect it to be, and then it heads in a very different direction. It heads there very quickly too, and then you kind of get a fun ending. I will say the last couple panels are a lot of fun because you get introduced to a character obviously that we'll see later in the Marvel universe. But yeah, it was nothing that I expected it to be.
Yeah, I mean, the death of Gwen Stacy has also two very big monumental moments, which is also, I think this event does in this book itself, shows you and even shows Phil the superheroes are just as human as you and I, because the big epic battle with the Green Goblin and Spider-Man over the bridge, Spider-Man trying to save Gwen Stacy from the Green Goblin. And of course, Gwen Stacy falls, and Spider-Man does everything he can to rescue her. And unfortunately, the force of his web catching her before she hits the ground snaps her neck. So it's not, and that's what's very interesting. It's like, because of what happens, like we still, meaning the humans, don't even know if it was in fact Spider-Man who killed her, but Spider-Man, Peter, still lives with that guilt no matter what. He lives with the guilt. He tried to save her and he failed. That was a big thing. A superhero failed. And then a superhero kills, because he kills Norman Osborn, the Green Goblin. So that also is the big revelation of Marvel Comics going in the direction that they're going, and how the superheroes and the direction that they're going in. The superheroes are human, they have emotions just like you and I, and they have a dark side, and they will use their powers to fuel that dark side. So That's one of the few things that I take away in regards to the evolution of the superhero. It's the death of Gwen Stacy. The superhero fails, the superhero kills. That's monumental, monumental. But we do get a little bit of a happy note at the end. Phil basically decides that he's done his time. It's time to retire. It's time to go on to his next big adventure. And he calls the paper boy to come and take a picture with him and his wife. And he asks the boy, "What's your name?" And he says, "My name is Danny Ketch." Unless you are a comic book reader, you don't know how important that name is. That child will eventually go on to become Ghost Rider. So the beauty of that moment, and I love where Kurt Busiek puts it in there, is to show you that this is the end of Phil's story, but the Marvel universe lives on and it changes and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. I would also want to recommend to the both of you, I will flat out say it's not as good as Marvel's, but there was a spiritual sequel that was written by a whole different group a few years later, like in 1996, 1997. It was called Code of Honor. It basically takes you through the Marvel superhero world from the 1970s into the late 80s, early 90s through the eyes of a police officer. So the police officer encounters everything from the first appearance of the Punisher to the events of the Dark Phoenix saga to Secret Wars. There's a whole bunch of interesting events that take place. It does not hold a candle to Marvel's, but if you want to see the history continue on through the eyes of humanity, I would recommend Code of Honor. So still, it's hard to believe that Marvel's is 30 years old. It is crazy to believe that this book is as old as it is right now, considering when I first read it personally. But I feel that it still very much stands the test of time. It is still very much a story unlike any other. It is amazing how so many stories, whether it's based around big names from the big two to indie stories, how they try to mimic what Kurt Busiek did back in 1994. It would be very hard to mimic what Alex Ross did back in 1994 because there is only one Alex Ross, and there's no shame in saying that. But it was a game changer, this book. It really, really was, because I don't think anybody looked at how comic books were written the same way ever again after Marvel's was made back in 1994.
I think it really did. Like it was, I just love I really like the fresh perspective. Like we've been talking about, we see the superhero world through the eyes of the civilians. And for me, that just kind of completed the picture. Just my entire reading experience reading comic books this year. I've seen it a lot through different superheroes' eyes, and now I see it through somebody else's perspective too, and it really adds a lot to the world.
Yeah.
I will stand on my hill and die. I am a DC girl forever, and it's just, it's part of the comic process to enjoy very historical Marvel comics, and this was definitely one on the path that I know that you and I had talked about well before we had decided to read it. I think that this is, again, not one for a new comic reader. I think you need to be a little bit seasoned going into this just to have kind of an understanding. Also, so you're not reading it through a confused, foggy lens, because I think that you could very easily get wrapped up in, am I missing something? Am I supposed to be focusing on something else here? Visually, like I said, it's stunning. You cannot compete with Alex Ross when it comes to his imagination and what he's able to bring to life. I think the way that he draws also is very telling to this story because it is so human based. So you get a lot of very visually spiritual kind of feelings, you know, with a lot of these images, where it feels very epic. You know, when you look to the sky, when you look to the cosmos, when you have an entrance, whether it's a hero or a villain, you know, it's just like, ooh, it's awe-inspiring. And like I said, it did very much make me feel like as a human, I was a human spectator in this story. So for that, I can value it. I can definitely walk away with some knowledge. But overall, I walk away with this, you know, just feeling like the box has been checked. It was overall very dark and depressing though. So for that, I didn't have that, you know, gusto feeling closing the pages and like, oh yeah, you know, this is something I'll read again. It's probably something I wouldn't revisit anytime soon. But I think if someone is asking for some Marvel history or, you know, something where they can kind of take various pieces of Marvel characters, this is definitely one you could recommend to people. It's because you do get introduced to a array cast of characters, both human, villainous, and heroic, which is super cool, you know. But I'm a DC girl till I die.
Well, I wouldn't look at it as recommending it to someone in regards to being their first Marvel read. I would
No.
personally recommend it to people because I want them to read Kurt Busiek's work, and of course, I want them to see Alex Ross's art. I mean, that's how the kid on my school bus got me to read this book. He says, "You just got to check out this guy, Alex Ross's art. You're going to love it." But of course, you know, I would basically say, hey, if you liked Marvels, then read Superman's Secret Identity or read Astro City. If you like Alex Ross, read Kingdom Come. Just put Alex Ross's name in your Google search and click on the images tab, and you will see some of the most beautiful superhero artwork you've ever seen in your life. I mean, definitely take a look at mythology, take a look at Marvelocity, those two books written by Chip Kidd and Alex Ross, just to see all of Alex Ross's Marvel and DC work in one place is just what any Alex Ross fan could ever ask for. I will actually hope and pray, because Alex Ross, years before I came to where I currently live, actually did do a signing at my comic book store. It was long before me being there. Part of me hopes that he will come back, because I would love to just say to him, before he signs my copies of Mythology and Marvelocity, I would love to say to him, "Do you want to know what my favorite piece of your work in this Mythology book is? It is the picture that you drew of all of the Hanna-Barbera superheroes. The fact that you drew Birdman, Space Ghost, the Herculoids, the Galaxy Trio, that is music to the ears of my inner child, and I thank you for existing, good sir." That is what I want to say to this man. Forget about the fact that he modeled his versions of Batman after famed actor Gregory Peck. That is my favorite picture that Alex Ross has ever drawn in my eyes. But there's so many great things. I'm not kidding. Just go into Google and just type in Alex Ross. You will see some of the most beautiful art you've ever experienced. You really, really will. So I think that that's going to wrap up another episode over here on this channel. Once again, Lindsay, I just want to say again, on behalf of everybody here who you have worked with and met, we thank you so much for taking some time to spend some time with us. And we thank you for having an open mind, and we're glad that you have officially jumped into this world. I have no idea how far down the proverbial rabbit hole you will go, but one way or another is I hope you have an exciting journey wherever it takes you. And we really do hope to have you back on this channel talking comics and all this fun stuff one day soon in the near future.
Agreed.
Thank you very much. It was so, like I said, it was really wonderful to be a guest on this channel. I was a big fan even before I was invited on, and I got some really great comic book recommendations from this channel. And then this year I read so many more just wonderful comic books. A few of them, like Hush, are one of my favorites now, and it's been really great chatting with you all about comics and learning a lot more about them.
Well, thanks for being here. You made it fun.
Please let us know how your progress is going on your end. Your links to your channel are going to be here for everyone who is curious. I mean, there were still some really great ideas that I had. I wanted to have a really good discussion with you about web comics because this is something that you do, and I really want to learn more about them because it's still something that I'm not familiar with. But at the same time, we just want to hear more about your progress on your personal project. And more importantly, we are very excited to see any possible discussions or reviews of comic books on your channel because we'd like to know what you're reading as well.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'll keep my channel
Of
updated.
course. So thank
Take
you all
care,
very
Lindsay.
much. Please leave a comment, leave us a like. Let us know if you've read this book, what your thoughts are on this book. Do you feel as energetic about it as I do, or do you feel a little bit more on the critiquing end as Cami does? But that's not a bad thing at all. Not at all. The fact that we have differing attitudes, Cami, personally made this video even more exciting because I personally thought you were going to gush over it just as much as I did. I had no idea that this is what you were going to give me, and I love it.
It's good. Don't get me wrong. I'm not digging at it for the wrong reasons. I think that it just, for me, it was lacking in the story, and I don't know, maybe just coming off certain stories of recent, this just didn't hit me in all the right places, but it was still visually amazing.
Absolutely. But that's, as I said, it's Alex Ross. So everybody out there, subscribe to the channel. Please hit that notification bell so you're up to date with all of our latest videos. And there's some exciting stuff that's going to be coming down to wrap up 2024 and some really great ideas, ladies and gentlemen, and everybody in between. There's some really great ideas brewing for 2025. I hope you're here for it. We'll see you in the next one.